Our Great Decisions lecture today will be delivered by Evans Revere, who is one of America's foremost experts on East Asia. Evans has extensive experience negotiating with the North Korean leadership. How many people can say that? Evans has had a great career at the State Department and served as the Deputy Chief of Mission in Seoul. He was also posted to Japan, China, and Taiwan. He is one of the few Foreign Service officers to master Mandarin, Japanese, and Korean. He is currently a senior advisor at the Albright Stonebridge Group, and we are fortunate to have his views on the perplexing situation in the Korean Peninsula. Evans?
Thank you very much, Noel, for that kind introduction. Today, it's my intention to speak in my broken Brooklyn accented English, not in any of those languages, so bear with me. It is a special, very special honor, and let me begin, in addition to thanking Noel for the kind and somewhat over-the-top introduction, a very special thanks to President Clifford, and also to the World Affairs Councils of America for your kind invitation that has brought me here today, back here to Washington, my old stomping grounds. I'm actually located up in New Jersey these days. I'm a foreign policy and national security professional. That's what I did for a living for a long time, and I've long admired the work that you do and that your affiliated organizations do around the country. To foster greater understanding of and engagement in the foreign affairs challenges facing America. So I think it goes without saying, as we look around what's happening these days, that work, the work that you do, is more important than ever. And I salute you for your outstanding contributions, and I certainly congratulate you on the occasion of your national conference. I should also add, as somebody who's been through more than one presidential transition during my career, that your timing is impeccable. You get to watch the sausage of a new government being formed, new policies and new personnel being put in place in real time, and that's an unusual thing. And so having been through all of those transitions, this one is unique in some respects, and it will not be boring as it continues. I've been working on, in, around, connected with Asia now for a little bit over 47 years, mainly focusing on America's relations with China, with Taiwan, Japan, and both South and North Korea. And as I reflect on that experience, and particularly on the results of last week's presidential election, let me begin my remarks by suggesting that some of the greatest diplomatic and security challenges that the United States is going to face during President-elect Trump's term in office will be in the Asia-Pacific region. I think over the long term, the greatest of these will be the geostrategic challenge posed by China, something we can already see reflected in the growing strategic rivalry between the PRC and the United States, and in China's ongoing efforts to try to supplant the United States as the dominant power in Asia. But if President-elect Trump were in the room, and looking around he doesn't seem to be, I would argue to him very strongly that the most immediate and literally explosive challenge that he's going to face is going to be from North Korea. And at the risk of ruining your lunch, let me tell you why. President Trump is going to inherit a more dangerous North Korean threat than any of his predecessors did. I think that goes without saying. And after his classified national security briefings that he's been receiving over the last several days, the president-elect now almost certainly knows that the bill for decades of U.S. failure to stop North Korea's nuclear weapons program, that bill is going to come due on his watch. And that's a very daunting thing. I use the word failure not to criticize any previous administration, including the current one, but I use it rather to make the point that nothing that 4 U.S. administrations have done has ended Pyongyang's pursuit of nuclear weapons. North Korea has been offered incentives, rewards, presidential security assurances, security guarantees on the one hand. A series of U.S. administrations have also tried pressure, sanctions, threats, isolation, etc. None of those things individually, nor any combination of them, has worked more than temporarily. So America now faces the nightmare, and I use the word advisedly, of a nuclear-armed North Korea that has actually threatened to use those nuclear weapons. North Korea today can already target South Korea, Japan, and U.S. bases in those countries with nuclear-tipped ballistic missiles. They can do that today. And Pyongyang will likely be able to strike more distant targets, including U.S. bases in Guam and Midway and Hawaii, and eventually the continental United States, almost assuredly within the next 2 or 3 years. North Korea is also developing solid fuel medium-range ballistic missiles that would enable it to disperse and hide those missiles and their warheads in various places around North Korea and give the regime a survivable second strike capability, which can be highly destabilizing. What are the North Koreans up to? What do they want? What's their goal in developing these capabilities and threatening to use them? For many years, a number of my colleagues argued that Pyongyang's nuclear weapons were bargaining chips that were somehow going to be traded for aid and concessions and inducements, etc. But those of us, like myself, who negotiated with North Korea over the years, and I can't tell you how many hundreds and hundreds of hours I spent at the negotiating table with the North Koreans, we came to realize, as those negotiations proceeded, that incentives were not of much value to the North Koreans. I was designated to be the person who opened up the U.S. liaison office in Pyongyang and eventually would have become the first U.S. ambassador to Pyongyang. That didn't happen. The normalization of political relations with North Korea was regarded as a major inducement by the United States. In the end, the North Koreans indicated that they were not particularly interested in that. So as we discovered during the course of these negotiations, Pyongyang was not building nuclear weapons just to trade them away for recognition and other things. Today, on reflection, we know that North Korea and its nuclear weapons, they fulfill 2 core requirements for the regime. The first of these is that nuclear weapons for North Korea are an insurance policy that guarantees the survival of the regime. North Korea is convinced that the United States would not attack a country that has nuclear weapons. The lesson of the Iraq War for the North Koreans was that Saddam Hussein's mistake was not having nuclear weapons. But there's a second reason for North Korea's nuclear weapons and its possession of the missile delivery systems for those weapons. North Korean representatives tell us privately, and I continue to meet with North Korean representatives at various undisclosed locations around the world these days. They tell us that they think, they know, they say, that they have the United States deterred. That's their word. They believe they have neutralized America's ability to bring its conventional and strategic capabilities to bear against North Korea. They say the United States, as a result, now has to live with a nuclear-armed North Korea, and that America and its allies and partners should accept North Korea's demand to negotiate a peace treaty to replace the Korean War armistice and carry out what they call arms control talks. And when you ask them what they mean by those talks, they say, well, these talks, the goal of these talks would be to remove the U.S. threat, which they define as the U.S.-ROK alliance, the U.S. alliance with South Korea, the presence of U.S. troops on the Korean Peninsula and the U.S. nuclear umbrella, our deterrent that we extend to our allies. Remove those things, eliminate those things, end those things, they say, and the threat will be gone. Well, here's the point. Pyongyang believes its nuclear and missile capabilities have fundamentally changed the dynamics of U.S.-North Korea relations. Pyongyang thinks it can now force the United States to end the U.S.-ROK alliance, to diminish the U.S. alliance with Japan, and remove the U.S. extended deterrent, allowing North Korea to achieve its ultimate goal, and that is the reunification of the Korean Peninsula on North Korea's terms. That's what nuclear weapons do in the minds of North Korea. And by threatening to use those nuclear weapons, Pyongyang is sending a core message to the United States. And roughly put, it is, we are willing to risk nuclear war to achieve our goals. Are you? The belief that it has changed the balance of power on the Korean Peninsula makes the danger posed by North Korea highly destabilizing, to say the least. Meanwhile, the North Koreans are hoping to leave the United States with no alternative but to deal with a nuclear-armed North Korea on North Korea's terms. That's why the North Koreans have declared the goal of denuclearization, the subject of all of these negotiations over the years. They declared that goal null and void. And that's why Pyongyang says it will continue to expand its nuclear arsenals and improve its ballistic missiles. By making its threats to use those weapons very explicit, Pyongyang hopes to force the United States to make a very, very difficult choice. Accept a nuclear-armed North Korea or risk war to prevent Pyongyang from realizing its ambitions. That's the choice they're trying to present us with. Many people, when we talk about North Korea and fixing the problem and solving the problem and dealing effectively with North Korea, talk about China. Let me just very briefly touch on China. I believe, after extensive discussions with my Chinese colleagues over the years and lots of experience living there and working with the Chinese, I think we have probably reached the limits of Beijing's willingness to do more to pressure North Korea. The signs are all there. That's why Beijing's cooperation on international sanctions implementation has been limited and even grudging. It's no accident that a draft Security Council resolution that would toughen sanctions on Pyongyang has been languishing for several weeks, a couple of months actually, up in New York at the UN Security Council. China's position on North Korea is increasingly being driven by broader geopolitical concerns, especially in the context of Beijing's growing rivalry with the United States. And in that context, North Korea is not necessarily seen as being a liability in the eyes of the Chinese leadership. China's leaders believe it is better to keep a troublesome North Korea afloat than to risk the chaos that might result if North Korea collapses. And accordingly, I think my recommendation to the President-elect would be we should be very modest in our expectations of China, which is increasingly disinclined to do the United States a favor, a phrase I hear from my Chinese friends a lot, by pressing Pyongyang. And I think we should also avoid, as some have been doing lately, describing North Korea as China's problem. Pyongyang's nuclear weapons are aimed at U.S. bases, at U.S. allies, and soon enough at the United States itself. And for that reason alone, subcontracting America's security to a Beijing that is inclined to sympathize with Beijing's plight, in my view, would be the height of folly. Instead, when our Chinese friends tell us that they have little influence over North Korea and little ability to change North Korea's ways, I think we should take them at their word, accept that as a given. And in response, the United States should tell our Chinese friends that Beijing's inability to act requires that we do in defense of our interests and our allies and ourselves. But we should, to be very frank with you, also realize that the steps that we would take to intensify sanctions on North Korea and other actions that we might take would have a negative effect on China, Chinese companies in particular, since they're doing business with North Korea. And those steps are likely to complicate U.S.-China relations. But that should not prevent the United States from doing what it must in its own defense, and that's a message we need to very clearly convey to the Chinese. So, policy options. What can we do about all this? The list of options for the president-elect is a very unsatisfactory one. It includes choices that fall very far short because they are deficient or defunct or dangerous or defeatist, and some of them, quite frankly, are even delusional. Very quickly, let me run through the options. The first I define as staying the course plus. President Trump could pursue a version of current policy, gradually increasing sanctions and pressure and isolation of North Korea. And he could continue to hope that the passage of time and the cumulative effect of sanctions will somehow convince Pyongyang to resume denuclearization talks. That's essentially been the policy track that we've been on for a while. But that approach has not worked. And it's not likely to work in an acceptable time frame, because North Korea's nuclear and missile threat is becoming increasingly urgent and will become even more so in the coming months. And with North Korea having emphatically rejected the idea of denuclearization or even a discussion of denuclearization, and having reaffirmed its intention to increase its nuclear arsenal, gradualism as a policy is unlikely to work. Another option, military action against North Korea, which some have advocated. The United States and South Korea could take, theoretically, military action against North Korea, destroying its known nuclear facilities, missile facilities, and military infrastructure. This would leave North Korea incapable of mounting a significant ground counterattack and would render its armed forces pretty much ineffective as a fighting force. But North Korea could still, despite that, inflict major damage on South Korea. Anybody who's been to South Korea and has been to Seoul and knows that roughly half the population of South Korea lives within easy artillery or short-range missile range of North Korea knows this. And even a broadly successful air campaign against North Korea would not and could not guarantee that North Korea would not use its nuclear weapons or other weapons of mass destruction against the ROK, South Korea, or against Japan, or against U.S. bases and forces in the region. Military action against North Korea, in my view, is a dangerous option that would undermine regional stability, possibly provoke a conflict with China, create peninsula-wide chaos, and cause major damage to our South Korean ally. Another option would be to somehow live with a nuclear North Korea. We're hearing that in some quarters as well as a possible approach. Some people argue that we should accept the fact of a permanently nuclear-armed North Korea and live with that, and rely on containment and deterrence, those old standbys, to defend ourselves and our allies and prevent proliferation. Doing that would reverse decades of U.S. policy, and it would damage, perhaps fatally, the global nuclear non-proliferation regime. It would shake the confidence of our South Korean and Japanese allies, who have adamantly refused to accept Pyongyang as a nuclear weapon state. And calls would escalate in both South Korea and Japan for them to develop their own nuclear weapons. And Pyongyang would continue, even under that circumstance, to enhance its nuclear and missile arsenals, and its incentive to engage in proliferation would be strong, especially since the non-proliferation regime would have been undermined, and especially since America's will and leadership had been undermined by accepting them as a nuclear weapon state. So accepting the North as a de facto nuclear weapon state would make things, in my view, worse, not better. Another option is talking about something else. We want to talk about denuclearization. The North Koreans do not. So what about the idea of accepting North Korea's proposal to discuss replacement of the Korean War armistice with a peace treaty as a substitute for a discussion of denuclearization? Some say a peace treaty would diffuse tensions, it would convey U.S. seriousness about dealing with Pyongyang's concerns, and would remove what Pyongyang often describes as the root cause of bad relations with the United States. I think that thinking and that idea is off base. Buying into North Korea's proposal would damage ties with our ally, the Republic of Korea, which is not prepared to negotiate a peace treaty with a nuclear-armed North Korea. Seoul would surely not accept a peace treaty discussion in which it is not a central player. And for those of you who may not know this, the North Korean proposal is for North Korea and the United States to negotiate a peace treaty. South Korea would not be at the table. That's just a non-starter. Entering a peace treaty discussion with a North Korea that retains its nuclear and missile arsenals while foregoing denuclearization discussions would buy into the North Korean game plan that I discussed earlier. North Korea wants a peace treaty that leads to the end of the U.S.-ROK alliance, and the next U.S. administration, I think, should not put the United States on such a path. Another option, a freeze on the North Korean nuclear program, or a cap on the program. The idea would be freeze it at its current levels and try to eliminate it over time through diplomacy and dialogue in the hope that we could achieve that goal. Would that were true. A freeze leading to denuclearization was the central premise of the 1994 agreement with North Korea, which I was a part of, and also the September 19th, 2005 six-party agreement with North Korea, which I was a part of. Both of those efforts failed. A freeze or a cap, remember, is only as good as the means to verify it, and the North Koreans have made it clear privately and publicly that they will not accept international verification. Full stop. Our inability to monitor and verify an agreement would leave North Korea's uranium enrichment facilities, the ones that we know about and those that we can guess about, would leave those facilities in operation. North Korea would be free to improve its existing warheads. It would be free to continue to manufacture larger and better warheads and would make other refinements to its weapons even during a so-called freeze. And a freeze that does not halt the testing and development and deployment of ballistic missiles would allow Pyongyang to continue to improve the delivery systems for its weapons. So if the goal of a freeze is to prevent the North Koreans from making additional nuclear weapons, by definition it won't work. And it would leave the United States and its allies vulnerable. Unless a temporary freeze on nuclear testing and plutonium production is part of an agreement that leads quickly and immediately and verifiably to complete denuclearization, it runs the risk, quite frankly, of creating the illusion of progress when none is actually being made. The last option I want to throw out there that's been talked about is what I call the nukes for everybody option. Some, including some whose name I will not mention here in polite company, have suggested that the solution is to allow Japan and South Korea to develop their own nuclear weapons, and that person has since disowned that statement, and with good reason. When someone is threatening to blow up your neighborhood, responding to the threat by giving everyone in the neighborhood a can of gasoline and matches, I suggest is not the most productive approach. So, it's time for a different approach, ladies and gentlemen. The rising threat from a nuclear-armed North Korea requires the United States to adopt a strategy that reflects the urgency of the threat. And to be fair, the Obama administration, I think, had made some strides in that direction after the fourth nuclear test in January and was taking some steps in that direction. But going forward, I think U.S. policy needs to be built on an even stronger foundation, and one that includes deploying improved U.S. and allied military capabilities on and around the Korean Peninsula, enhancing our extended deterrence, and measures to physically demonstrate the determination of the United States to fulfill its commitments, increasing the scope and frequency of U.S. and allied military exercises, perhaps to include some of the other members of the United Nations Command, including our friends, the Brits and the Aussies. The United States, in my view, must apply immediate and unprecedented pressure on the North Korean regime to compel it to change course. North Korea needs to be convinced that it will never be accepted as a nuclear weapon state, and that the United States is prepared to respond to North Korea's nuclear ambitions with steps designed to defend and deter, contain, and respond, and that we will raise the cost to Pyongyang of its pursuit of nuclear weapons to an unacceptable level. U.S. policy should make clear that its preference, the United States' preference, is the resumption of meaningful dialogue with Pyongyang. Diplomacy and dialogue remains a good thing, and that the United States should make clear that it stands by its past agreements to eventually normalize relations with a non-nuclear North Korea. And Washington should also, and I think it would be helpful, to assure Pyongyang that we are prepared to engage at the highest levels with North Korea to address the full range of North Korea's concerns if Pyongyang is prepared to reopen a serious denuclearization dialogue. To do all of this, and this is key, the United States has to be prepared to put at risk the one thing that North Korea holds more dearly, cherishes more dearly than its nuclear weapons, and that is the preservation of its regime. Doing so, I think, would ultimately convince the North Koreans to follow a different path. North Korean officials tell us, publicly and privately, that their goal is the preservation of their regime, and they believe nuclear weapons help them achieve that goal. We need to convince them otherwise. U.S. policy should emphasize a central new message to North Korea. If regime survival is the goal, your continued pursuit of nuclear weapons will not only not achieve this goal, but undermine it. How do we do this? What are the tools? The tools are already at hand, and they include strengthening economic, trade, financial, and other measures specifically designed to starve the North Korean regime of hard currency and disrupt the ability of the regime and its companies and state-run enterprises to do business in violation of UN sanctions. Sanctions on North Korea should be intensified to the level once applied on Iran. This is not widely known, but the level of sanctions that we have on North Korea today are a fraction of those that we once imposed on Iran. And this should not be done in an incremental or gradual way. To have the full effect, it needs to be done very, very quickly over a matter of weeks and months, not years. And the United States and like-minded countries should expel North Korea from the international banking system, including denying Pyongyang access to the global financial transaction clearing system. Secondary sanctions should be applied on third country entities, including Chinese companies that do business with suspect North Korean entities. Existing authorities under the UN Security Council resolutions should be used to pressure and, if possible, shut down firms, including travel and tourism countries, that currently do business in North Korea, contributing to North Korea's economy and providing them with hostages, as we've seen from the various Americans who managed to get nabbed. The international community should intensify the inspection and interdiction of suspect North Korean vessels and aircraft, and the U.S. should consider imposing a naval quarantine to prevent North Korea from violating UN Security Council sanctions or trading in illicit materials. There should be an international effort led by the United States to freeze or seize overseas North Korean assets if they can be linked to illicit activities, and surveillance of overseas North Korean trading offices should be increased with an eye towards shutting down these in cases where they are in violation of sanctions. And the United States should encourage the international community to stop trading with North Korea and be prepared to cut off from our markets firms that continue to do business with North Korea. There's new U.S. legislation that the Congress passed this summer that calls for an increase in information operations against North Korea. In that context, the United States and others should explore what I think are some very interesting vulnerabilities in North Korea's communication system, particularly their cell phone system, to maximize the flow of information into the country. And those of you who have a background in intelligence operations know that there are ways we can do this. Efforts should be made to encourage overseas representatives of North Korea to defect or to cooperate with international law enforcement. Covert activities designed to exploit vulnerabilities in North Korea's communications, banking, and financial systems should be considered, but the less said about that idea in public, the better. Let me wrap up by saying and acknowledging that all of the things that I just proposed all of those ideas carry with them risk. But the risk of allowing North Korea to increase its threat, in my view, is much greater. The Trump administration has to be prepared to act from day one with a sense of urgency and determination and intensity, especially since, if I know my North Koreans, and I do know my North Koreans, they will challenge the new administration very early on. No country knows the risks associated with the above approach better than our ally, the Republic of Korea. Importantly, however, Seoul's message to Washington has consistently been one of very firm determination and a clear willingness to accept the risks. However, the political implosion that we are witnessing in Seoul these days has created a major uncertainty about South Korea's ability to stay the course. And we cannot rule out the possibility that a successor Korean government in a few weeks or a few months' time might opt for a different course in dealing with North Korea. This bears very careful watching. The new U.S. administration must very carefully consider South Korea's concerns, sensitivity, and politics. And as the Trump administration works with Seoul to coordinate next steps against North Korea, it must avoid alienating our important ally or taking it for granted. At the same time, the administration should avoid fueling South Korean fears that Washington might abandon its allies, and those fears exist today. The words of reassurance that the President-elect used in his call to President Park last week were important and absolutely necessary. In the current atmosphere of uncertainty and suspicion about U.S. attitudes towards allies, one cannot emphasize enough the importance of providing reassurance to one of America's best and oldest friends. And finally, as the United States faces the rising danger of a nuclear-armed North Korea, it's going to need those allies, as many as we can get. And the new administration, I think, should make it a priority to build the closest possible ties of trust and confidence with these allies. And if we do that, therein, I believe, lies the prospect of some success in dealing with North Korea. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, and Noel, thank you for sponsoring this Foreign Policy Association lecture, Great Decisions lecture. We have time for a few questions, and if you haven't asked a question yet in the conference, raise both hands. Andrea.
There's a mic.
And by the way, I'm here to interpret in the Boston accent for his Brooklyn.
I'd be interested in your assessment of Kim Jong-un as a leader, specifically compared to his father and his grandfather.
Yeah. I think it would be fair to say that there is a declining level of gravitas that began somewhere about 1945, August 15th, and has been moving downward. And I guess the good news about Kim Jong-un is that he knows that. He understands that. And many of the things that he has done domestically, but also internationally, are intended to make up for the fact that he is not seen in the light that his father was. And he is certainly not seen in the light that his grandfather was, to the extent that he's may have, in view of some, have undergone some surgery, and the haircut and the way he acts and the way he holds a cigarette, it's reminiscent of Grandpa. But this is a young person, rather inexperienced person. This is a person who's on the job training for the job, probably only began, in my guesstimate, around 2008 or 2009, a couple of years before his father passed away. This is a person who has never served in the military, has never served in the government before he became the leader. His main qualifications for office is that he is the son of his father and the grandson of his grandfather. That's it. So what you see is a young, inexperienced 30-something in charge of his own country. That's something I guess young people in the audience can aspire to, who has felt it necessary to demonstrate internationally and domestically that he needs to be taken seriously. And the way you do that domestically in a totalitarian system is to scare the whatever out of the elites, which he has done. If you are a North Korean official, military person, party elite, party cadre, what you have seen since he has come on board are executions, some of them pretty brutal, it is believed. You have seen purges, you have seen people disappear, you have seen some interesting traffic accidents in which senior officials have gone away. This is his way of communicating to them that he is in charge. But if you are one of those officials, my guess is that you are probably thinking about a plan B today. Even if you are the most loyal and patriotic and fervent admirer of the system and of the regime. And that's something that I think that we and our friends and partners can play to. But this is a man who needs to be taken seriously. He has got a couple of dozen, at least, crude nuclear weapons, but deliverable ones, and has threatened to use them. And I cringe when I see people making light of the threat and light of North Korea and using all sorts of epithets against him. It sometimes does appear ridiculous, but it's getting increasingly serious.
Jackie Miller, World Affairs Council of Seattle. I think we're closest U.S. city to Pyongyang missiles. So
They've got you targeted.
we were targeted.
But for some reason, they selected Fort Worth as one of their targets, if you remember that video from North Korea. Why Fort Worth?
So we're incentivized to talk about this. I want to come back to sanctions. A more intense sanctions regime requires Chinese buy-in. China is North Korea's largest trading partner, so to have an effect, don't we have to have Chinese buy-in? And if they're not particularly inclined to do any favors for us, how do we get there?
Mm-hmm.
And then if we do manage to get an effective sanctions regime, why do you think that that would necessarily change behavior? We have a sanctions regime against Russia that's had an economic effect, but hasn't affected behavior at all.
Fair questions. On the China factor, ideally, it would be best to have Chinese buy-in. But as I said in my remarks, and my remarks are based on extensive conversations and watching policy in Beijing begin to evolve in a problematic direction, we're not going to get the sort of buy-in that we would want and that we would need to make a universal sanctions regime as effective as we would like it to be. Having said that, do not underestimate the degree to which the United States, using some very interesting powers that the U.S. Treasury Department has, and the rest of the international community, and most of the international community is on side with us, do not underestimate the degree to which we can put pressure on North Korea in very interesting ways. The list that I gave you is a small example of the things that we could do to make the life of that regime miserable in a very short period of time. What are North Korea's options at that point? 90% of its trade is with China. So worst case this, the US, Japan, the EU, Korea, South Korea, and other countries in the world use all of the tools at our disposal, but without the level of Chinese cooperation that we would like to put pressure on North Korea. One of the results of that is that it pushes North Korea closer to China. How is that a bad thing? Because it then compels China, in the eyes of the international community, to do more to act on North Korea. And the Chinese agenda for North Korea, and I believe this is true, is to implement the sorts of economic and social and political reforms in North Korea that the Chinese implemented in the 80s and 90s. How is that a bad thing? Because even that situation would be better than where we are today. But once again, going back to that other point, do not underestimate the power of the international community, even absent China, to put pressure on North Korea. Remember back in 2005 when the US Treasury Department put some sanctions on an obscure little bank in Macau called the Banco Delta Asia. And one of the effects of that was that the North Koreans went crazy because it had a powerful effect on them. But what was not very well understood back then is the effect it had on China, because that was a bank that was linked into the Chinese financial system. And the Chinese saw the writing on the wall that Chinese banks and Chinese companies were running the risk of being excluded from the United States banking and financial and trading system as a result of their connection to North Korea. That message was delivered in spades a few weeks ago when the U.S. Treasury Department put some very interesting sanctions on a Chinese company for the first time. There are things that we can do with China as well. Sanctions overall. Let's remember, as I said, 90% of North Korea's trade is with China. North Korea's links to the outside world are rather limited. North Korea is increasingly becoming a cash economy because they're being cut out of the international banking system. North Korea is not Iran. North Korea is not Russia. North Korea is not China. This is a country that is living on the edge in terms of its ability to feed its people and survive. And I would submit to you, in response to your second question, that the power and the sanctions and the pressure and the isolation that we could bring to bear on North Korea would be, quite frankly, overwhelming, whereas we cannot necessarily do that against a Russia or a China or even an Iran.
For students, here you go.
Hi, my name's Katie Hickey from the Vermont Council on World Affairs. And so you mentioned that the one goal of North Korea is the preservation of its regime. Does that preservation include expansionism? So let's just say all fair and done, and hopefully that we achieve peace with North Korea. Do they seek to become a regional hegemon, like we've been discussing throughout the conference? Or is it like what you said, that because they think that they've succeeded in deterring North America, do they already see themselves as a regional hegemon of the area?
The notion of a country of 23 million people that can't feed itself becoming a regional hegemon, I think, is probably a bridge too far. But in terms of their territorial ambitions, there's one territorial ambition, and that is South Korea, the reunification of the Korean Peninsula under their aegis. Having said that, if they were able to achieve that goal and keep their nuclear weapons, they would play a very interesting and profoundly disturbing role in Northeast Asia, not in terms of a hegemonic presence, but in terms of being a wild card as we try to maintain peace and stability in Northeast Asia. I think that's the big danger, not that they have any expansionist goals, although the North Koreans continue to have some very interesting territorial claims against China.
So we've gone from New England to Washington State. Let's go right in the middle to Pierce. Do you still have a question? No, I don't. They've been asked. I need someone from, oh, Fort Worth, of course.
Be careful, the North Koreans are watching you.
Well, actually from Dallas.
I knew that.
But very close to Fort Worth. My name is Amina from the World Affairs Council of Dallas. I have two questions. The first is, why are there less pressurizing sanctions against North Korea when as compared to Iran, when we know that they have nuclear weapons, and we weren't exactly as sure with Iran. And second, can North Korea form ties with someone other than China, like with Putin of Russia or something?
When I find out the answer to that first question, you'll be the first to know. When I was in previous administrations and when I was talking with my friends in the current administration, I would ask that question all the time. And the sense I got, quite frankly, was that the sense of urgency was never quite there. There was always something else going on. There was Afghanistan going on. There was Iraq going on. There was the big relationship with China that we needed to protect. And I understand all that. But it's now been 4 U.S. administrations that have followed, with some important footnotes and exceptions, a roughly similar approach in dealing with North Korea. Pressure, isolation, sanctions, mixed with some rewards and incentives. And here we are. My sense is that the nuclear test in January and the one that took place in September were a real wake-up call to this administration, and I hope to the next administration, and reinforce the point that I made in my remarks that we can't continue to do what we've been doing. That's the definition of insanity. It hasn't worked. And those other options are unlikely to work either. We need to have a different, a new, and a more effective approach. Your second question again was on? Yeah.
Not China.
There was a time back in the Soviet Union days when there was a useful relationship, useful in the minds of the North Koreans and the Soviets. The reactor that's at Jongun, the nuclear reactor that makes plutonium, is originally a Russian reactor, Russian designed. I've been in the reactor room. You can actually see the Cyrillic writing. It's still on the reactor, it's still there. Missiles, a lot of the North Korean missiles that we're seeing today, especially the older models, are basically reworked, rejiggered versions of old Soviet-era missiles. I think the Russians do not see themselves as a major player. For all of the problems in the U.S.-Russia relationship today, and there are a lot of them, the one issue when I talk to my Russian friends that really gets on their skin, under their skin, is proliferation. You know, for all of their problems and headaches that they're causing us these days, when it comes to nuclear proliferation, the Russians are very hard line. And who is the poster child for violation of non-proliferation norms? North Korea. So to give the Russians credit, and I can't believe I'm saying this, when it comes to North Korea, they're actually pretty tough when it comes to the non-proliferation aspect. But they're also interested in mischief as well. And I think there's a similar view between Beijing and Moscow, that they see North Korea occasionally as a useful tool to get under the skin of the United States, to be very frank.
You know, in broadcast journalism, we would have sound up just like that. It was not intentional, Evans. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. You've been a great audience. I appreciate